Right, Oliver's just started to record. Perhaps I could ask everybody to switch their microphones off. That would be a good idea. Hello, everybody. I'm Tony Burns. I'm one of the three co-directors of the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice, and I'll be chairing this evening's session. Our speaker's Dr. Amy Wendling from Creighton University in the United States. So I'll just introduce her, say a little bit about her, and then she can get going. Amy is a professor of philosophy and associate dean of humanities and fine arts at Creighton University, which is a Jesuit university in Omaha, Nebraska, in the United States. She's the author of two books, Karl Marx on Technology and Alienation, and The Ruling Ideas, Bourgeois Political Concepts, which was published by Lexington Books in 2012. She's written many articles about the philosophy of technology, political economy, ethics, and the intersections of race and gender. She's going to be giving a talk this evening on the skill concept in Marx's writings. The session will run for 90 minutes. We're scheduled to finish at 7:30. Amy will speak for about 40-45 minutes, which will leave plenty of time for discussion. Right, okay, I think that's it. Over to you, Amy.
So I'm Amy Wendling. I really appreciate the invitation. As I was sharing before some of you came on, one of the benefits of COVID is it taught us to use this software while also leaving us exceptionally place-bound, and we are still really in the recovery from that. And so I have enjoyed learning to use the technology to give talks and attend talks all over the world in areas of interest. So this set of ideas, which I've been working on for one of the volumes that's coming out in the Historical Materialism series with Brill, comes from just looking at the skill concept as it is used in Marx, but also beyond, and thinking about the stabilities of the concept that allow us to use it critically, but also the instabilities of the concept that Marx himself gets to in Volume 3 of Capital, that make the concept somewhat complex. So I'm going to read through some of these observations and then extemporize a bit when warranted. So when Marx thematized skilled labor in really the first volume of Capital, automation was a threat to that kind of labor because that kind of skilled labor was elevated and aspirational, and it was skill, specifically skill, that machines threatened to absorb. At the same time, even in the early Marx, automation is a relief when labor is drudgery, and no one ever worries about giving up drudgery. Right? As I'll talk later, I perform data entry of various kinds. I'd be happy to have that taken over by what one of my colleagues in English has described as our artificial intelligence overlords. So as I dug into this, I think we need to understand the skill concept more deeply and more fundamentally. This work starts to undertake that analysis. Ultimately, I'm going to argue that the concept itself is mobile and can be deployed in capitalism's interest, such that capitalism and the social form of capitalism will portray skilled as non-bodily. It will portray the unskilled as skilled. It will portray the skilled as unskilled, right? And I'll give examples of each of these. And so too, what I call the legibility and illegibility of various skills begin to be determined by capital's requirements. Now, there will be limitations to this argument, and I'll just highlight those at the very beginning. I can either play the violin or I cannot, right? Skills also admit of degree. My Arabic can be advanced, intermediate, or novice. And as I find with I oversee the languages where I work, I may be able to speak a language and not read or write, which is basically my situation with Dutch. Some skills are only acquired at great pains, others are acquired swiftly. So I mark that just to say I can see that we could say, well, Wendling, you can play the violin or you cannot, right? As a kind of limit to the argument I'm going to propose that the concept is malleable and drifts across various categories. Okay. While an automaton may appear to be self-possessed of will and consciousness, because the behavior we traditionally associate with these attributes is on display, it can be an illusion. So think about Descartes and how he talks about the humans outside his window may just be hats and coats, concealing the automaton, the will of another. However, for Aristotle, the set of political distinctions we build upon in the Western political tradition, the importance of volition and consciousness and their true location, is the basis of a division of the human concept into free and enslaved, and albeit somewhat differently, we get gender, male and female. And if a whiff of slavery can be detected in these 19th and 20th century de-skilling debates, it's hardly accidental. When your computer identification system demands that you declare, I'm not a robot, right? Nor is it accidental, I think, that we'll see gender divisions of labor are central to discussions of skill, and especially to the concept's conventional definition. We rightly think of Marx as an origin of the critique of labor's de-skilling. However, as I have said, and as we all know, he also celebrates free time that some automation of tasks could produce once this would be liberated from the capitalist social form. And it's probably helpful simply to think of him as one of the origins of the 20th century concept of automation. So automation clearly requires the replacement of human labor, but Marx is careful to emphasize that it's not a full replacement. So the role of replacement in the labor process, I think we've misunderstood. And if we follow Marx to the very end of Capital, we can see it better. Human labor is certainly replaced, but it's not really replaced in a one-to-one fashion, and not without significant changes in what labor means, accomplishes, and does. And we could say the same thing about skill. Skill is replaced, and not in a one-to-one fashion, not without significant changes in what skill means, accomplishes, and does. And so there are both hopeful and terrifying iterations of the concept of skill. And maybe Descartes' fears about misjudging machines are really just fears about what we humans will become. So Marx's theory of alienation, as I say in a number of, I'm on the wrong side of history in Marx's theory, with still just loving to talk about the importance of the alienation concept, the enduring importance of the alienation concept throughout Marx's corpus. So wrong side of history, and this is the hill I will die on. I've already heard, I think, what could be said about that, though I'm interested to hear more. But I think the theory of alienation bears directly upon the changes to labor process we see characteristic of the 18th and 19th centuries. And of course, this theory predates Capital and also Marx. I have a fun game I like to play. It's called Who Wrote It, Marx or Hegel? And when I play the Who Wrote It, Marx or Hegel game at my best, I can get people to guess Marx every time, and it was Hegel, who wrote in the Jena manuscripts, of course, but also in the Aesthetics, as Sean Sayers gloriously reminds us. As Sean Sayers gloriously reminds us, the Aesthetics is actually Hegel's richest account of making, right? Making and doing. And so already, and Lukács draws attention to this too, this labor process in the Jena manuscripts, humans can hand over some work to machines. This is a citation from Hegel, but our own actions become correspondingly more formal. Our dull labor limits us to a single point, and the work becomes more and more one-sided. The individual skill, and here it's the Geschicklichkeit concept, is the method of preserving our own existence. And this would be the fun part where I say, who wrote it, Marx or Hegel? Thus, a vast number of people are condemned to utterly brutalizing, unhealthy, and unreliable labor in workshops, factories, and mines, labor which narrows and reduces their skill. Again, the Geschicklichkeit. I'll spare you the aesthetics today. It's a long passage. So when Marx takes up in those famous 1844 manuscripts the charge of describing what's happening to skill here, he adopts the German vocabulary of Fremd. So that's the estrangement, the more virulent terms from the manuscripts, which comes into English as alienation. It's Entfremdung. And they track this insight that alienation is not a general psychological or social phenomenon solely. It may also be that, but tied to the way work unfolds in industrial modernity and already in Hegel. So as this audience may know, in those 1844 manuscripts, we get 4 moments of alienation. Here's a sort of very quick one-sentence summary. We're alienated from our products, from our activity, from the species, and as a consequence from the species, from other humans and ourselves. We live in material poverty, and boring, repetitive, dangerous work is the reality for a majority of persons. There's a degraded and overly fixed notion of human nature, and there are fractious societies with false concepts of what the human is and does. And so this skill concept actually develops all four moments of alienation, I think, in ways that are interesting. So already in Hegel, we can see the central term around which changes to labor characteristic in the modern period are theorized, and that is skill, Geschicklichkeit. So this is a little bit unfortunate for two reasons. The first is that the overemphasis on the intellectual dimension of skill neglects kind of a second important term, namely strength. And the second is that the skill concept considered in general is structured not only by this reduction, but also by other biases particular to capitalism's interests, including a set of issues related to how capitalism metabolizes scientific literacy. And I think the pressures on the skill concept that are produced on the skill concept are so intense that we border even on incoherence, with the proviso I outlined earlier, which is, of course, you can play the violin or you can't. So in the 1844 manuscripts, we get Marx writing that the laborer does not develop his or her mental or physical energies freely. So the physical language is there. And in the Grundrisse, we get the machine possesses skill and strength. This is Geschick and Kraft in place of the worker, and then has this language virtuosity. This is going to come back, right? So he calls the machine the virtuoso. And that, again, when we see that virtuosity language, the Latin language, we do have Marx sort of highlighting this kind of rich idea of skill and this rich idea of labor. In chapter 15 of Capital, Marx writes of skills in a bodily way that emphasizes handling of tool, and we get the virtuosity language again, and the concern that the virtuosity, being a virtuoso with something, the violin example is not accidental, as it turns out, right? Gets passed over to a machine. Okay. But in other passages, we lose the strength or bodily habit as at least a very prominent theme, right? And then we get it substituted with the intellect. So we get also from the Grundrisse and machinery that the knowledge specifically appears as alien and external. And Marx largely avoids thematizing de-skilling primarily or even exclusively as knowledge, but does open the door for others who will. Particularly when de-skilling is thematized as knowledge, and knowledge is thematized primarily or as exclusively cognitive, we really, really risk losing a bodily element to skill. And for better or worse, the category around which much of the critique of de-skilling unfolds is cognitive de-skilling. Once you lose that bodily element, a bourgeois apologist can always come in and argue there will be new skills to develop as others are eclipsed, right? Since one kind of knowledge can be learned just as well as another, knowledge is unlike the slow acquisition of bodily habit, one form of which is strength. And the limitation to the domain of cognition covers over the fact that relatively few working persons will need to gain new skills compared to those who are displaced. It also covers over the fact, I think, that new knowledges, at least for the vast majority who do not become part of what we might call a managerial class, are thinner and thinner in content and so speedily acquired, right? So new knowledges, because I think we could also argue that some kinds of knowledge, like years and years of working on Hegel, comes to mind, right? Years and years of working on Hegel is not speedily acquired, and yet there are some kinds of new knowledges, like learning to work Zoom, that was pretty speedily acquired by comparison, at least with that example. So there's this wonderful text by Harry Braverman, who writes that short-term trends opening the way of advancement of some workers and rapidly growing industries simply mask a secular trend toward the incessant lowering of the working class as a whole beneath its previous conditions of skill and labor. So I'm skilled, but I'm in no way as skilled, or I'm very differently skilled than the previous conditions of the class as a whole. And as this continued, still Braverman, over several generations, the very standards by which the trend is judged become imperceptibly altered, and the meaning of skill itself becomes degraded. So if skill is progressively degraded in the way Braverman outlines, there's new technologies, this is that Karl Fry calls augmenting technologies. Well, these would be themselves increasingly alienating, or even themselves replace skilled human work because they degrade the skilled concept, even as they enable new jobs. So just to talk for a minute about the automobile, right? Arguably 20th century augmenting technology does employ many, but on assemblies lines that restrict worker movement and curtail all but repetitive and limited motions. If I am temporarily well paid for swiveling in my chair and typing answers to my email, right? This does not alone mean that the clerical environment is very different from the tailorist factory. And Braverman also argues this. He's got this wonderful example I'll go through a bit later about how my trips to when I'm involved in clerical labor, my trips to the water cooler are limited. Someone did a time motion study and got the water coolers situated so for minimal interruption, right, to clerical task. So I think it's really harder for a bourgeois apologist when you consider the loss of strength and the general eclipse of bodies in kind of late capitalist society. The best argument, which is that machines can do harm and harmful physical labor, right, is not a sufficient alibi for removing all physical movement from work or for constraining workers from natural or spontaneous physical movements, right? And this is what we witness in clerical situations in many ways. Braverman describes this 1958 Bright scale, which has 12 kinds of worker contribution, such as physical effort, mental effort, dexterity, right? Dexterity, the specific kind of skill, general skill, whatever that might be, and education, and takes all of these through 17 levels of increasing mechanization. There are complex shifts in most of the kinds, and as you reach levels 12 to 17, all kind of ultimately become non-existent worker contribution. Of the 12 kinds, physical effort is distinguished by its lack of complexity and reaches the level of non-existent contribution already at level 5, from which point sedentary workers are assured. And his example is that the water fountains are deliberately relocated to make sure you don't have to walk too far to access a drink. Every step is a loss to capital. So in the AI debates that we see, we sort of see the eclipse of the body in Moravec's paradox. Sophisticated computers play chess, do taxes, diagnose your cancer. I read on the Reuters that one of them is going to be the CEO of some large company. I would like to assign one to answer my email. I mean, we can go on, right? But, right, the AIs they lack the perceptive and mobility skills of most humans 1 year of age or older. That's the paradox. It can play chess and run a company. It can't walk. It has no mobility skills. Not having a human body, including perhaps even its weaknesses like lapse of attention and fatigue, is probably a significant block for machine learning. But in an environment where the skills of perception and mobility are not required by the labor process, those same artificial intelligences are not unskilled. So it doesn't matter if I cannot mimic human perception if my task is simply to transcribe or tabulate numerical data. So in addition to the issues raised when we restore strength to its rightful place among the alienations brought on by de-skilling, there's another difficult question. What is skill exactly? So not even the vocabulary is consistent. Marx and Hegel use several different German terms to try to capture the concept in its relationship to the changes of modern labor. Geschicklichkeit is richer in content, this is Hegel's term, than Fertigkeit. Hegel already drawing attention to what is being narrowed and reduced in factory labor. Marx moves us to the virtuoso vocabulary, invoking a highly complex skill set, both bodily and cognitive, we associate specifically with performing music, right? Performing music. We know with some precision what Marx meant by de-skilling as he considered the onset of factory labor with the giant steam engines in the manufacturing workshop, and it's specifically the function of controlling the pathway and pacing of single tools operated by hand, both knowledge and the specifically bodily habit of operating them, including the strength required. But once the skill concept gets generalized beyond this historic example, it's much less clear what actually it is describing, and unclear concepts are really easy targets for occupation by capitalist norms. Now, I live in Nebraska. We have no people, we have more cattle than people. And so it's natural for me to consider farm and ranch labor, right, which Braverman invites us to do. So if I think about my father-in-law, it's actually, so considered unskilled. I think farm and ranch labor would be considered unskilled by kind of knowledge-based educational metrics of the 20th century. It's actually a highly evolved set of skills, the transmission of which is based in an apprenticeship system that kind of begins in human infancy. From the rhythm of meals to the physical strength needed to lift a 40-pound calf, moving your cattle from grain to grass and back and forth when grass is scarce, or to when grain prices are high, back to the grass. Basic carpentry, masonry, irrigation technology, and veterinary medicine come along with ranch labor. Long-range timing and planning are crucial. And there's the reading to keep abreast of how the artificial intelligence will shortly change the operations of your tractor. Well, this is unskilled work, right? Similarly, domestic labor, as feminists have known for a long time, and Martha Jimenez, I recently reviewed her book, her wonderful book, Domestic Labor, she says, like all forms of labor, is an acquired skill. The propensity to see it as unskilled can come from a variety of factors. Either you've confused unskilled and unwaged, you've got your gender, race, and class markings of domestic labor, and the third, I think a disproportionate use of the skill concept in sociological literature, only in association with non-domestic tasks. My accounting professor, he was so funny. He was a male accounting professor. I had to learn to do accounting to do my dean's job, or my associate dean's job. It's really boring. I warn you, it's really, really very dull. But he wonderfully was engaged in, he would read all the circulars for kind of basic commodities he used in his household. And then he would spend a full day driving around and get the milk from here and the flour from here. And he then, of course, because he was an accounting professor, he calculated how much money he'd saved over the 30 years he had pursued this. It was really extraordinary. He was very, very lovely. But no one's going to argue that that's not unskilled work. And yet it gets absorbed in the unskilled bracket, these kind of consumption labor bracket. Now, capital, I think, does tend to reduce human work to unskilled work, but it simultaneously portrays various data entry tasks as skilled, right? And their acquisition is upskilling. So instead of my consumption labor of my beloved accounting professor, consider the highly skilled work that lands me at a sophisticated computer monitor. I'm doing cognitive labor. I've got a lot of lifestyle. I've got a lot of sedentary time. Programmatic features of software and hardware condition the pacing and timing of my work, from posture to something I read about in my second book, which is like an internalized awareness of abstract time, multitasking and interruption, telephone, text messages, and email. And I am struck as I do more and more of this skilled labor, just how much data entry I do. So how many of us typed in the access code to get on to this Zoom? And I as I was fretting about the talk early this morning here, I had to type in a number of codes, and literally my highly skilled work is to type from my dual authenticator advice into a number of platforms in order to make sure I'm going to be able to broadcast abroad and all of these things. I do convert documents from one format to another in a very charmingly unskilled part of my skilled labor. And so too, I think many of us are having leisure hours devoted to data entry on increasingly smaller devices in the form of social media, accepting and rejecting notifications, downloading an app, checking in for medical appointments. And so at the very end, and I will leave time, I'm going to make fun of the calendar programs that are kind of becoming a feature of our clerical life. And so I think the category of skill is essentially malleable to capital's purposes, and that Marx recognized it. And in the third volume of Capital, he calls attention to these two basic instabilities. The first of these is that the division of labor makes skills and skills more basic and so easy and quick to acquire. Right. So once I'm not doing a very holistic task, but a partial task, this is Adam Smith. Well, now that partial task is easier to learn. Capital also likes to call unskilled those actions that are illegible to its purposes or whose importance it wishes to deny. Right. It does celebrate as skilled actions, however degraded they may become, that advances its interest. And just as there is, I may die on this hill too, no technology per se outside of a social form, begins not to be skill beyond what capital names. And I think similarly, as Braverman points out, educational attainment is like this. So what capital is going to call and celebrate as education will be thinner and poor, mostly education for how to do data entry more efficiently. Another problem with the skill concept is, especially when predicative of humans, is its individualism, right? Or in a variation of this, we see it as a talent of a particular subset of individuals. So I oversee the arts, and ceramicists, by the way, work as a group. You can't actually fire a wood kiln by yourself, as it turns out. It takes a team of persons. And I think this has really helped me to better understand, as I thought about skill in the arts, that skill really nearly always comes about in human community. And we speak about it. We don't speak about it that way. We say once possessed, it sort of is some kind of private property of a human being or a subset of human beings who have, in a traditional vocabulary, acquired that skill. But I think that falsely shapes our understanding of skill and what the losses are when skills become obsolete. So it's not merely that you lost something like a pair of shoes or an iPhone, or even the dispossession of a set of guild skills and secrets. Skills of individuals in small groups also neglect the kind of skill that may be generalized to a larger group. And I think that this is one of the things Marx is trying to get at when he talks about the general intellect. So the level of general intellect that a society has. The passage that names the general intellect is this famous one in the Grundrisse. It's frequently parsed in the Marxist literature, especially those Italian autonomous traditions. Unlike in Capital, right? The Grundrisse is not so exclusively bound by capital as a social form, so you get sort of a range out in the manuscript work. And I think also that Tony Smith's work is very good on this, because one thing Marx himself ties to the general intellect is the practice of science. So Tony Smith revisits the issue of science at the time of the Industrial Revolution, and he argues, convincingly, I believe, that science was already a matter of daily practice of skilled craftspeople. So this is Tony. He writes, an exclusive focus on de-skilling oversimplifies Marx's position, and such an exclusive focus understates the extent to which the general intellect was already diffused at the time of the Industrial Revolution. That is, not monopolized by a small group of scientific and technological experts. There's this wonderful example about that Braverman cites from a historian of science and technology, Bernal. And Bernal observes that the Royal Institution there in London had to brick up its back entrance at a certain point in history to keep out the mechanics who stole into the gallery. So such a wall attempts to sever the connection in both directions between skilled working persons and scientific knowledge. And probably if working persons are the losers here, so too is science. Motivated by the kind of control this wall emblematizes, a mythology of the separation of concept and control from execution really does separate us off from actual histories of science and technology. We have a large medical school here, and medicine was a trade, right? Medicine was a trade. It's very interesting to really look at these histories, restore the working class histories to things we think of as pure science. So on this view, I think, capitalist workplaces have always relied on a set of skills appropriated without recognition from its unskilled working populations. It just does not wish to recognize them, and so inculcates them while denying that they exist. And Marx points this out frequently in the Grundrisse, often using this vocabulary about things that are free of charge. There is lots of debate about how to imagine the universal social knowledge that makes up the general intellect. I'm going to just gesture to it here, and then I'll talk about the calendar program as I promised. But just recall that Marx's vision for the role of the general intellect in the society anticipates is pretty clear. Universal education is one of the demands from the list at the end of the Communist Manifesto. And we can sort of imagine that while capitalism appropriates the substance of the general intellect free of charge from working persons, while denying that it's doing so, we can imagine a society where the general intellect might play a very different role. And that's the role of the dream of free time, not an empty bracket to fill with consumer objects or yet another opportunity to enter data on my machine, but a time to become a virtuoso. There is another big debate about whether the general intellect can really develop in this capitalist social form or not. I will leave it to the group to discuss how they feel about that issue. Nick Dyer Witherford, this is a contemporary, follows Marx most closely, I think, when he argues that, at least with the general intellect, capital calls into being forces it cannot control. And this, this is imagery from Marx too. And for this reason, capitalism just does different things. Sometimes it develops the general intellect, contributes to its development, or at minimum does not hinder it. It does at all times try to discipline and constrain it into desired channels that may themselves be contradictory. And we can think of the general intellect as embodied in any of several institutions, science and technology, education systems, especially those universal education systems of the capitalist welfare state, the internet for Dyer Witherford, and expect that there will always be a battle over and for the contents of the general intellect. So back to the wall at the Royal Institute. So interesting. I pulled up the Bernal text, and we learned that the Institute itself was put into place in 1799 precisely to cultivate scientific literacy among the working population. Count Rumford was no Democrat, but he did need scientifically trained mechanics to shore up the productivity of the Industrial Revolution. The wall, to block the mechanics out, went up swiftly, however, under its first director, sometime in the first third of the 19th century. And so here, it's a very, very telling, I think, illustration of exactly this battle over the general intellect. Capitalism both needs the general intellect and it fetters its development in according with these tendencies that work against each other, and the working classes can must have and cannot have science. We see this play out in debates around education, and this is that second instability in the capitalist skill concept that Marx is working on in the third volume of Capital, where he writes that basic skills are reproduced ever more quickly, easily, generally, and cheaply, the more the capitalist mode of production adopts and adapts popular education. So on the one hand, you get the manifesto, Education for All, and on the other, the more capitalism adopts popular education, the more the skill concept is going to be degraded. When popular education universalizes a skill, and Marx's example in the third volume of Capital is commerce and languages, the result is de-skilling, since the supply of the skill is decreasing its value. Skill is legible only relative to context and determined by relative scarcity. And so the mass acquisition of skills through education will itself be a de-skilling. Okay. Braverman is really critical about universal education, right? So on the one hand, universal education, scientific literacy, hooray. On the other hand, if what scientific literacy amounts to is that I can copy one number from one electronic service to another, maybe not. That's a very general, very fast characterization of the critique. All right, the calendar program as promised. So I'm just struck by, it's both humorous and exhausting that there are programs that attempt to take away the skill of managing your time, right? And they try to interface with one another badly, which I find to be very, very funny. So I just have a meditation on that to close the talk. So where a person or set of persons was responsible for coordinating the significant affective and social dimensions of setting human activities into a space-time continuum, now calendar programs use cloud technologies to proliferate schedules through various devices. And I'm going to actually add a third form of this. There's also the habits. I'm thinking about the rancher again. So even before someone organized it, I inherited this set of work habits and this temporal economy on the ranch, right? Without anybody really having organized it. I inherited it as a kind of apprenticeship. Then someone organizes it. Let's imagine that scenario, right? And now calendar programs tell us what to do. They display all features of all four categories of alienation. I think features of the de-skilling, reskilling debate, and features of this struggle for the general intellect. So abstract time, as Marx argues, was one of the achievements of capitalism. And once labor could no longer be measured by usable objects, as every contribution was very partial, we began to measure it with time. Following Marx, E.P. Thompson and Moishe Postone have charted the consequences of abstract time for the 20th century, including and especially those struggles around time. So calendar programs continue the intensification of temporal domination in our own era. They are tailored to an age where concentration of persons in a workplace, the factory or office model, has begun to erode, or even, especially when combined with video, in situations such as janitorial work, where labor is dispersed from direct human observation. In the unprecedented dispersion of clerical labor inaugurated by the coronavirus, calendar programs are part of the arsenal of monitoring software that functions to observe workers and standardize time without the need for workers to gather in a single physical space. And I just had my first experience at the grocery, right, where I'm checking out my own groceries and I've messed up, I've moved weirdly. And the person monitoring it, there's not a lot of personnel available. The guy comes over and he reviews a video, and I watch myself bungle, the transaction on screen, right? There's even a specific skill that calendar program seeks to supplant: time management. Competent clerical workers who manage schedules lose jobs as they're replaced by other kinds of schedulers. Individuals conditioned to manage their own work time in other ways, a clock or watch, so traditional, not yet outfitted by the new calendar functionalities. I call mine a dumb watch. I think, right, I also have lost some of the internal time consciousness required to manage my dumb watch. Now, if I'm very autonomous, I alternate between programming my calendar and then jumping to its set of bells and whistles. If I'm both commander and executor serially with those functions separated. If I'm less autonomous, I'm only jumping to the pre-programmed increments, with the calendar acting as a time card. The internal time consciousness that was the specific achievement of the abstract time era now consolidates in one way, even as it begins to erode in another. And so you get this capitalist technology that's very ambivalent. On the one hand, calendar programs enable an unprecedented domination of time segmented into micro units. However, on the other, this frees the operator from some of the bounds of internal time consciousness. Especially with longer instruments, your mind can kind of drift in passive or spontaneous reflection that's not accompanied by a consciousness of the abstract time that has passed, because a programmed interruption will notify you with a bell or a whistle. These longer increments, however, are increasingly under assault by notifications themselves. So one feature of the calendar program that we work with up at the university is fixed increments and start times. So we use a particular brand of company that I won't say. There's an appointment scheduler. Each meeting time is divided into precise 15 minutes units. These can be stacked for a longer meeting, but their boundaries cannot be flexed. Artificial intelligences can calculate not only the start time to an appointment or task, but also the transit time needed to get to it. Time to leave for work, says my phone. And while a work buzzer sounds 15, 5, and 2 minutes of advance of a start time for the next task, it really makes it more difficult to forget or to drift in unaccounted for time. I've observed this elsewhere in my second book, but the control function of the calendar can actually overwhelm its productivity function. And this is because I actually think capitalism is not more interested in control than it is in productivity. And in places where those two things conflict, it will take productivity sacrifices in order to maintain control. So some dead time that could have been allocated to other tasks, where the skilled operator is still able to flex the temporal continuum, is now spent waiting for the next increment or buzzer. Passive time and spontaneous time are thereby converted into waiting time, and we anticipate the next task. Now, not only are passive time and spontaneous time important to humans, working humans as well as other humans, and our well-being and our sense of autonomy over the activities we're engaged in, they're arguably important to the labor process. That's the time in which a skill might be considered reflectively, right, and improvements to process or technology undertaken. But once waiting time supplants passive and spontaneous time, all that's left are tasks. So instead of skill, right, we now talk about task. Calendar programs are, moreover, embedded within other programs, email programs and teleconferencing programs, with our own audience excused. Multitasking, which is another offender against passive and spontaneous time. is built into the functionality, and so is surveillance, as supervisory technologies can look into your environment at any time, including from remote locations, can take screenshots of your activity in random frequent increments, as I experienced at the grocery, and can compile productivity data about task completion. For this reason, the electronic stamp of logging into a computer monitor or smartphone is as reliable as a punch card or identity badge, and the electronic surveillance systems that ensue subsequently far outstrip human powers to physically observe workers. Humorously, as I say, calendar programs do try to speak to other calendar programs, though with only mixed success so far. An appointment calendar allows my students to book advising appointments in one asynchronous system, but that has to be pre-programmed by trained advisors and then integrated into individual calendars. And at present, the translation of one calendar program to another requires a great deal of disavowed human labor. Like that poor student who we spent several hours trying to remember what the time difference was from London, even as we linked up the technologies. He went into his room and I went into mine, and we calculated it, and then we made sure we weren't on the East Coast. So while the programs claim efficiency and self-sufficiency, human labor is again pressed into service free of charge to sync up all kinds of calendar programs. As I book a medical appointment or train journey, a program asks if I want to send it automatically to my calendar. In fact, I think all of life's activities are subject to this kind of unprecedented semi-synchronization, semi-automatic synchronization. Galit Wellner's work, talking about the smartphone, talks about what she calls everyday carry, right? And the smartphone becomes an object that's like that. In the process, of course, the calendar programs are part of an ongoing erosion of whatever thin distinction may have remained between working and non-working times. As for relations with other humans, the calendar programs makes them disappear. So instead of calling and saying, oh gosh, when would you like to come over and talk to me, student who may not be making a perfect grade in chemistry, now each of us programs a schedule and asks the other to access it, right? Addressing any gaps that programs may have with more programming. And so the great achievement of calendar programming, which is asynchronous scheduling, is thus their liability. So on the one hand, you have skill and task, and on the other hand, you have the calendar program bringing to our attention another boundary concept that shapes the notion of what skill is and what is not, namely programming. It is precisely the difference, I think, between skill and programming that undergirds the, many worries about what is distinctive to human labor. I'll read the last paragraph because I know I'm at time. If to capture this distinction between skill and programming, we reintroduce that concern not only for volition, imagination, and consciousness, those terms with which we began the essay, but also for strength and habit and mobility, this illustrates a general truth. Just as there is a struggle for the general intellect, so too there's a struggle for skill. And the ability to name skill will be a weapon in capital's arsenal. And if capital can call unskilled work skilled in order for workers to save face, it will do that. If it can determine skill as non-bodily, it will do that. If it can avoid remunerating skilled care work by calling it unskilled, it will do that. And I'll stop. Having promised Tony that I would, just in time.
Okay, thank you very much.